The planning is already underway for our new International Affairs Forum season that will start in September. If you see on your lecture handout, there is a sneak peek of what those issues are. I think we have a pretty impressive list of experts and of topics. We're going to start with assimilation of Muslim communities in the Western world. We're going to move to climate change with a Rear Admiral who started the U.S. Navy task force on climate change. And then we are going to have a former NSC official who will talk about the long goodbye of the United States in the Middle East. It's going to be quite interesting. And as always, we welcome your involvement. We welcome your comments. We welcome your suggestions. This is an all-volunteer group, nonprofit. We try to stay as nonpartisan as possible, and for that very reason, we need your input, and we appreciate that. And all of those people who you saw stand up earlier, you can approach any one of them and let us know what you think. So, without further ado, I'd like to ask Jack to introduce our very special speaker tonight, and I'd like to thank you all again for your support of the International Affairs Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's a great honor and privilege for me to continue a discussion that I've had with over 50 students at Northwestern Michigan College. They are students of my age or slightly younger who have been attending a class that I have been teaching in the evenings, and we had our last class on Tuesday night, where we talked about the history of Syria. And it's an opportunity that we have all taken together as a group to try to understand a bit more about the country that we're going to talk about tonight, but also more broadly about the region, about what our interests are there. And as we as voters move forward into the election campaign, we hope that these events, such as this, and the ones that are coming up before the election, will give you an opportunity to make an intelligent and informed choice, and that is our goal. Tonight, Karen and I are really delighted to bring to you a Foreign Service tandem couple. And these are folks that we have served with in the Middle East years ago. Allison Barkley and Ambassador Robert Ford have served our country in some of the most dangerous and difficult countries that there is on the planet, and in the Middle East in particular. Whenever I hear a dedication at a public event to our brave military and their service that they give to their country, I always whisper in the back of my head, and to our brave diplomats who also serve in these same places. And Allison and Robert Ford are a great example of such a couple. They do it without a lot of fanfare. They do it often without a lot of support, without a lot of protection. And they do it because they want to serve their country, and they want to help our country navigate through the dangerous and difficult situations that we find ourselves in today. Robert Ford is currently serving in the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. as a senior advisor there, and he is the Kissinger Fellow at Yale University. So he's just begun teaching at Yale, and we are very delighted that we happen to coincide with summer break so we can get him here, much to the jealousy of our colleagues in Grand Rapids who haven't been able to land such a famous person. Ambassador Ford is one of our leading experts on the very troubled region of Iraq and Syria. He served in Iraq twice before becoming ambassador to Syria. And he exemplifies what has become a norm for today's diplomatic corps. His strength of character in confronting the dictator Bashar al-Assad face to face, and his defiance of efforts to limit his travels to the sites of an emerging revolution speak volumes about his personal integrity and courage. His subsequent efforts, based on his in-depth understanding of the people and politics of the region, to steer U.S. policy in a direction that was not particularly welcome always in the corridors of power in Washington, but which he knew held the best promise for success, was yet another example of his moral courage and his patriotism and his leadership. So friends, please join me and welcome Ambassador Robert Ford.
Can everyone hear me? Great, excellent. Jack, Jack has disappeared, but thank you for that very nice introduction. I don't know why it was so short, though, Jack. It's a delight to be in Traverse City. I've never been here before. I would just like to introduce my wife, Allison. Allison, if you want to stand up. So, Jack, Karen, and Allison and I go back to 1990. Jack was serving as the senior political affairs expert at the American Embassy in Tel Aviv during the Kuwait War, and you will remember that Saddam Hussein lobbed many Scud rockets at Israel, and in particular at Tel Aviv. Jack won't tell you, and so I will. Jack was the very calm, steady hand in the American Embassy that helped guide them through a series of emergency preparations, getting the staff so that they could do everything from react to drills and get gas masks on quickly because people expected Saddam to use chemical weapons, to a series of procedures so that embassy staff could call in and the senior management of the embassy would know that each diplomat and the families were safe. That was Jack who did that, and his military experience really showed through. And so Jack was a terrific leader, and it's wonderful to link up with him and Karen again tonight. So I actually watched the debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump about Orlando and the Islamic State and whether or not the Obama administration had caused it or known about it. And so last night I made an audible at the line of scrimmage and I changed the topic. And I want to talk instead about what we're doing against the Islamic State and what's working and what's not working. It's not going swimmingly, but it's not all bad either. But I'm actually going to take you into the belly of the beast a little bit. So, and Jack and Karen said, well, talk for about a half an hour, and then we'll take questions. And I said to Alice, I said, talk for half an hour? Talk for half an hour? How can I explain everything I know about what's going on in Syria and Iraq and the Islamic State in just half an hour? And Allison said, well, dear, speak slowly. So, I'm going to, as I said, take you into the belly of the beast, and I'm going to try not to speak too slowly. But let's go forward. Now, in theory, this advances. Oh, cool, it worked. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk to you about is the Islamic State itself. The Islamic State, this is, if you leave this room tonight with nothing else, I want you to leave with this understanding. The Islamic State is not just a terrorist organization. It is not just Al-Qaeda on steroids. It is a state. That is to say, it has a bureaucracy, it has a government. It may not be the most efficient government, but it is a government. It has a military, it has all kinds of government workers, and it has a system. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, they were in caves. They were sort of hiding. The Islamic State isn't hiding. We know exactly where it is, and it's very visible. You can see it. I mean, you could fly over it. We have US airplanes flying over and bombing it almost every day. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. This, anybody know what this is? This is a tax receipt. Osama bin Laden never gave tax receipts. Osama bin Laden didn't collect taxes. The Islamic State collects taxes in the places that it controls. This is a tax paid by a Christian. The Islamic State, part of their ideology, which dates back to strict application of Islamic law as it was practiced in the 7th and 8th and 9th centuries. It is Islamic. It's very old Islamic. It dates back that far. The interpretations they use are strict literalist interpretations as they were developed in, say, the 7th century. This is a Christian who had to pay a tax because he is a Christian, and if he didn't pay this tax, he would be killed, or he would have to leave the community where he lived. And so where it is circled there, it says in Arabic, he has paid the jizya. The jizya is the word in Arabic for a tax that Christians pay. It is in Islamic jurisprudence. Now, within the last 300 years, basically this was no longer collected. The Ottoman Empire, for example, stopped collecting the jizya. But if you go back in time to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, they did collect jizya. So, key thing is, it's not just a terrorist organization. It collects taxes. It has an army. It has a bureaucracy. It runs schools. It runs hospitals. These are school books up on the top left. On the far right, it's a geography book for middle school. The second from the right is a history book. Third from the right is another geography book. And my favorite on the far left, English for students in the Islamic State. These are books that the Islamic State developed. They have administrators. They have teachers. Anybody know what the picture on the right is? This is my favorite. I did not find this picture. Steve Heidemann, who's a friend at Smith College in Massachusetts, found this. This is a parking ticket. I'm not kidding. A guy right here. Now we'll see if this laser thing works. It does. Right there it says in Arabic, it's a Kia. And he was illegally parked and he got a parking ticket. I would presume in the Islamic State you pay your parking tickets. I can imagine that But what I'm saying is Osama bin Laden didn't write parking tickets. They do. They collect money from this. They have an organization. They're financed. And so it's important to understand that this is not just Osama bin Laden all over again. This is a different and much more dangerous thing. When the American air campaign against the Islamic State started in 2014, it was estimated that the Islamic State, with all of its tax collection and its oil receipts from oil fields that it was operating, was collecting upwards of $75 to $100 million a month. Osama bin Laden never had that kind of money. And so the Islamic State really is a big and much more dangerous thing because it has so many more resources, whether it uses them militarily or in social media or sending people on missions to Europe or who knows where. It has a lot more resources than Al-Qaeda could have even imagined. So now I want to talk a little about the American response to this. And I think the Americans had to respond. I've just explained the risks that the Islamic State has in terms of its resources and its ability to project influence and its ability to project threats against us. So this map, I'm going to give you a broad overview and then I'm going to break it down into pieces. This is a map used at a White House briefing in January. I looked for the latest map because there was a briefing last week and the White House hasn't put it out on the internet yet. So this map is from January, but it hasn't changed that much since the end of January. Key things to know from this map. The green areas here in Syria and in Iraq, this is northern Iraq here, this is northeastern Syria, and then down here in central Iraq, these are areas that have been liberated from the Islamic State, in this case by Iraqi, mostly Shia militia fighters, and I'm going to talk about that. Here, mostly by Iraqi Kurdish fighters, I'm going to talk about that. And here, mostly by Syrian Kurdish fighters. Damascus, of course, is down here, and Baghdad is down here. Those of you who are following the news would know that there's a lot of fighting right now in this place here, Fallujah. And I'm going to talk about that too. So the White House has, and you can go on Google, read what Brett McGurk said last week. He is the president's special envoy for the fight against the Islamic State. I served with Brett for years in Iraq. I know him quite well. Brett emphasized the following things. The Islamic State has lost a lot of territory. That's true. That's important. The territories it's lost means it can't collect taxes anymore. It cannot collect parking ticket fees, can't collect the jizya, can't collect other taxes. So they no longer get tax revenues in these places. That's good. Reduces their resources. These areas up here, some of them have oil wells. And so they've also cut the revenues that the Islamic State was getting from oil wells. We don't know exactly how much their revenues have been cut, but the estimate is they've been cut by at least half. And the Islamic State itself has publicly announced that they have cut their salaries for their fighting guys, their men in arms, by 1/2. And you can imagine what that does to the morale of the Islamic State fighters. So that's good. There's real gains here. Brett last week said that at this point they've retaken 50% of the land in Iraq that the Islamic State had seized in 2013 and 2014. So they've made real progress, especially I think on the Iraq side. The second thing to know is these areas that have been recaptured, notice that they're largely along the Turkish border. That was the area that the Islamic State was using to smuggle people in from other Arab countries, from other Muslim countries, from Europe. The rat lines that fighters were following came down through these areas. And as they're recaptured, there's less and less access for the rat lines to bring new fighters in. In fact, there's very heavy fighting going on right here. These brown areas in the map, these are the areas that the Islamic State still controls. And that little part right there is the last piece of the Turkish border that the Islamic State controls on the Syrian side, and it would not surprise you to know there's heavy fighting going on there right now. A lot of the American bombing is up in this area, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So the administration has made some real progress. They've been able to retake territory. They've been able to cut finances. The flow of fighters has definitely diminished. Just last week, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, said the latest estimate of the number of fighters of the Islamic State has dropped from about 35 to 40,000 to more like 20 to 25,000. So there's real progress in terms of eliminating the number of fighters. So it sounds like we're winning, right? It's not all bad. Now I want to talk about some of the problems. And some of these are long-term problems we're going to have to deal with a long time. So first I want to talk about what we're doing and the problems with that. So I'm going to start with this area up here in Syria that we have retaken. And how's that going? So the Americans have basically joined in with the Syrian Kurds who live in this northeastern part of Syria. These are Kurds that live up here. They're not Arabs, they're Kurds. Their own culture, their own language. And they were fighting the Islamic State because the Islamic State basically is a heavy-duty Islamic ideology, and the Syrian Kurds, their main leaders, are very secular. They're almost communist, really. And they resisted this heavy-duty Islamist ideology, and so they fought them. This is a picture of the fighting in a place called Kobani. You probably watched it on the news in the winter of 2014, 2015, about a year and a half ago. That's when the Americans started to really bomb the Islamic State. So that's the fighting. This town was right up on the Turkish border, right up on the Turkish border. This guy is one of the Syrian Kurdish leaders, and he's just opened their new office in Russia, in Moscow. Anybody know who that is? Yeah, it's Abdullah Öcalan. 10 points for whoever knew that. So now, Abdullah Öcalan, this guy here, not him, he's on the American government's terrorism list. He's on the European Union's terrorist list, his organization, the Kurdish Workers' Party. It's on Turkey's terrorism list. In fact, this guy's organization, the Kurdish Workers' Party, has been conducting a series of terrorist attacks in Turkey over even the last couple of weeks. Has killed a number of police and blown up public buildings. Some of the attacks in Istanbul, if you've been watching the news, there have been bombings in Istanbul. It seems to be an offshoot of this guy's group. We're helping them. I want you to understand that. We're helping a group connected to a terrorist organization on our list. The Turks, not surprisingly, are furious. And their line is basically, you're helping one terrorist group fight another terrorist group. And the administration's response to criticism from people like me and others, Turks, has been, well, yes, we are, but at least they're good. They're retaking territory. I want you to think about this for a minute. This group is trying to fight Turkey to give up parts of Turkish Kurdistan, basically. That's why the Turks are resisting. The Turks are very nervous that this guy's people in Syria are going to help this guy's people in Turkey and launch a civil war in Turkey. That's basically why the Turks are so angry. Turkey, by the way, is a NATO ally. So think about the long-term ramifications. This bombing, when this was going on, do you know what was happening in Turkish cities just on the other side of the border? Rioting, demanding that the Turks send in troops to help in Kobani. And when the Turkish government refused, just 15, 20 miles from here, there were riots, major riots in Turkish cities. The Turks had to send their army in to put it down. And the PKK, since then, this guy's group, has gone on a full-scale offensive in southeastern Turkey. There's been very bitter fighting. In some cases, house to house in southeastern Turkey. The Turks going after this terrorist group's people. I mean, it's nasty. So, that's how we're doing on the Syrian side. Now, if it wasn't enough that we're helping an affiliate of a terrorist group, and one that's basically in a war with our NATO ally, the group we're helping is itself not particularly savory. I'm not going to read the headlines. What I want you to understand is as recently as May, the groups we're helping, the Syrian Kurdish groups, have been accused of war atrocities and war crimes. The Islamic State is in this for the long term. Their expression they use, their motto de guerre, is Baqayun wa mumtadiyun. We're staying and we will expand. The Baqayun, the staying, is telling us they're going to keep recruiting and they're going to keep fighting. If the Syrian Kurds, as they clean out these areas, which are in many cases Arab, as Syrian Kurds commit war crimes against Arab populations, do any of you think that some of those young people in those Arab populations might decide to hell with it, I'm going to join the Islamic State? The Islamic State thinks so. This is a problem. By the way, the administration, whenever they're asked about this, they have no answer. Broader problem. The administration is really determined, and reasonably so. You've got to reduce the Islamic State's resources, tax base. You've got to clean it out. As it moves to get the Islamic State out of these parts of eastern Syria, who's going to govern it? It's a mess. These are pictures. The oil fields in eastern Syria have been destroyed, in many cases by American bombing, and the cities are destroyed because of the Syrian civil war. Who's going to govern these areas? And why does that matter? Why should Americans care? This is why. There are a number of surveys that have been done in the last 6 months among young Syrians and among young Arabs in general. Why do young people join the Islamic State? Here's the key point. The biggest single reason is not because they're jihadi wannabes. It's because they have no jobs. And if you can't govern an area, how are you going to rebuild it? And how are you going to provide jobs? So who governs matters a lot. This is another poll, I just threw this in. This just came out within the last 2 weeks by a group called the International Alert, and they interviewed 311 young Syrians. So again, both polls say the same thing: lack of economic opportunity, jobs. So the governance issue in eastern Syria here, this matters. Otherwise, they're going to keep recruiting. And they may be an insurgency, and they may not be writing parking tickets, but they're going to have lots of fighters to continue an insurgency. They'll look more like Al-Qaeda on steroids at that point. Of course, that means we'll be in this war forever. Now, I haven't even mentioned the broader Syrian civil war, but I have to. And I have to because, not because I'm interested in it, but because this is a message from Syrians in northeastern Syria, not where the Kurds are. But you can read it. This was just about a year ago. Their message was, if you don't deal with Assad's killing machine, there are always going to be young Syrians who join extremist groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Why is that? Human rights organizations estimate that Assad is killing 7 times more Syrians just this year, 7 times more Syrian civilians than the Islamic State. I want to say that again. The Bashar al-Assad, the barrel bombs that you see on TV, the starvation campaigns, the chemical weapons, has killed 7 times more Syrian civilians this year, 2016, than the Islamic State has. So not surprisingly, while the American priority is the Islamic State, the administration's priority is the Islamic State, most Syrians' priority is the civil war and the Assad barrel bombs and others. And again, the administration has no plan to deal with that. I'm happy to talk about that during the question and answer. I want to focus on the Islamic State. But the administration has no plan to deal with that civil war. They just tried peace talks again in Geneva, and they completely broke down again for the 3rd time. So now, that was the good news. Now I want to talk about the bad news, which is Iraq. So here's President Obama shaking hands with the current Iraqi Prime Minister, whose name is Haider al-Abadi. I know Haider quite well from my 5 years in Iraq. Haider here speaks very good English. He was actually an elevator engineer in Britain before the American invasion in 2003, and he came back to Iraq. Haider is the kind of guy, he'll come into a room, and there'll be a clump of Iraqi Kurds over here, and a clump of Iraqi Shia over here, and a clump of Iraqi Sunni Arabs over here, and he moves from clump to clump and sort of pats people on the back and says, how's your family, and how's that son of yours doing, and moves over here and whispers in the ear and tells them a little joke, and they're all laughing, and then he moves over here and smiles and pats them on the back. And most Iraqis don't do that. They're very sectarian, ethnically aware, and they don't socialize very well. Haider moves seamlessly that way across. That's why he's prime minister. He reminds me a lot of, he's kind of like an Iraqi Joe Biden is actually what he reminds me of. And he's not, this is important, he's not sectarian. I don't think he is a Shia, but I don't think he views Iraq in sectarian terms. I don't think he views it in ethnic terms, Arab versus Kurd. I think he actually transcends that. And so from my point of view, he's a good guy to have as prime minister. But the key point here is actually that he's not sectarian. He's not ethnically interested in ethnic cleansing and such things, but is Iraq itself moving beyond? As Obama said, the only lasting solution to the Islamic State problem is national reconciliation in Iraq and stronger Iraqi security forces. So now that's the president's quote from a year ago now. So we're working with the Iraqi military. This was a picture I pulled off the internet just a couple of days ago. We're doing training. We have special operations forces. We have some regular U.S. military forces in Iraq now. They had all left in 2011. We now have about 5,000 back in, and we're training. It's not going particularly well. There was a very detailed study that Reuters news agency just published, saying basically that the Iraqi forces are still so deeply riven by differences between Shias and Sunnis, not Prime Minister Abadi, but his soldiers and his commanders, that they don't function very well together. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. So this picture was shown all over Arab TV last week. This is actually a film clip that was on Arab TV networks last week. And what that is a picture of is Iraqi Shia militias financed by Iran, not under the control of Prime Minister Abadi, under the control of Iran, beating up a Sunni Arab in Fallujah who was trying to get out of the city and get away from the fighting between the Islamic State and the Iraqi forces. So this picture is all over the Arab media right now. Shia assaulting a Sunni. Notice how sectarian that is. And this has been an ongoing problem, as you can see from these headlines. I just point this out here. This is from Abu Dhabi's main newspaper just last week. So it's not just an Iraqi sectarian sensitivity. It's all up and down the Persian Gulf and in the Sunni world in general. This is exactly what helps the Islamic State recruit, this time in Iraq. It's exactly what helps the Islamic State recruit. Islamic State says, we're defending Sunnis against these awful Shia. We will protect you from these people. That's the recruiting message. They're doing it very effectively. Now, I mentioned about the Iraqi army. I think you would all know what that is, an American M1 Abrams tank. Anybody know who he is or what that is? This is the flag of Iraqi Kataib Hezbollah. It's also on the American government's terrorism list. And he's one of the terrorists. And he's standing on our tank. How'd he get it? The Iraqi army gave it to him. Our friends in the Iraqi army. These guys that were helping. I don't think Prime Minister Abadi approved that. I'm very sure he didn't. But the Iraqi army isn't always listening to what he's telling them. Now, beyond the fact that this guy and his group are terrorists, they killed a lot of American soldiers when I was in Iraq. Why is that a problem? Goes back to what I was saying before, that video of the guy getting beaten up. This is a picture of a Sunni mosque in the city of Bakuba, the end of last January. Remember what Obama said, have to have national reconciliation, have to have a strong army. The Islamic State set off a series of car bombs in this city, killed a lot of Shia. The Shia militia in that city promptly went door to door and killed, different reports give different numbers, but somewhere between 50 and 100 Sunni men. Literally pulled them out of their houses and shot them. There are lots of videos on it on YouTube if you want to watch. They also burned 7 Sunni Arab mosques. Here's one of them. When President Obama talks about national reconciliation in Iraq, which is necessary to undermine the Islamic State recruitment, it's not going very well. In fact, it's going rather badly. Now, there's also the Kurdish angle. I'm going to go back to that map. I really should put the map in. I should have put it in twice. So that town where the mosques were burned is right in there, Bakuba. And let me ask, have any of you did any of you serve in Iraq? Okay, well, that's all right. If you had, you would know that Bakuba was one of the worst places of fighting when the Americans were there. It's right up there, north of Baghdad. So this area here, Sunni and Shia, down here in Fallujah, national reconciliation isn't happening. What about up here? This is the other area where we've made a lot of progress retaking territory from the Islamic State. Well, ethnic tensions between Sunni Arabs and Kurds have always been a problem. They were a problem when I was serving in Baghdad. There were many instances where American forces had to intervene between Arab forces and Kurdish forces, or they would have started shooting at each other, even though they were all Iraqi forces. And that really hasn't changed. You can see here Kurds are displacing Arabs in Iraq in what could be war crimes. That's a Washington Post article. It's actually, the Post was reporting an Amnesty International report that was issued January 18. So if you want to read the real story, I wouldn't recommend you read the Post. Go to the Amnesty report itself, which was issued January 18. And they went and documented instances of Iraqi Kurds also committing war crimes against Arab communities. This little story, I think, kind of explains the problem of national reconciliation. I'm going to hop back to the map. I apologize. So right in this area here, right there. See how that's been liberated? That you could see where the green and the brown come together. That's where that fighting was back in February. Some of the Arabs who were in these areas were trying to get away from the Islamic State, and they got blocked. The Kurds wouldn't let them in, and they were left in a no man's land between Islamic State fighters and the Kurds. The Kurds wouldn't let them in. Now, the Kurds have let in some Arabs. They've not banned entry to all Arabs, but they have banned entry to enough Arabs that the Arabs feel that they're being excluded, even though they have the same Iraqi passports that the Iraqi Kurds have. They're all one country in theory. They all have the same passport. They're all citizens, but they're not all being treated as citizens. This touches again on the national reconciliation that Obama was talking about. National reconciliation is not something that an F-16 can fix. National reconciliation is not something you can carpet bomb to achieve. It's a political problem. And just as I talked about who's going to govern eastern Syria and the issue of rebuilding and getting people jobs so that they don't join extremist groups, you have the same question in western Iraq. Fallujah will fall. Fallujah will fall. But who's going to control that area? President Bush made the decision when I was in Iraq, frankly, we encouraged him strongly in this direction, to turn it over to the Sunni Arabs who were in that area and let them govern themselves. Wasn't perfect, but it worked out okay. It stabilized places like Ramadi, Fallujah, Mosul, so that the Americans could get their troops out. But now, fast forward, it's no longer 2007, 2008, now it's 2016. The Iraqi Kurds, they want a part. And these guys, I love the masks. These are Iranian-backed Shia militia. They're in there too, and they want a part. So who's going to control those areas? And is it going to foster the national reconciliation and the reconstruction needed to undermine Islamic State recruitment? Otherwise, the Islamic State will simply go back underground as it was before, will continue to fight, we will continue to have forces over there, and there will always be a terrorist threat. Even if it's not as well financed, just as Al-Qaeda under bin Laden was a threat, so the Islamic State will be. One last point about Baghdad. For all that Haider al-Abadi is a good guy, in my opinion, the national government is a mess. This was a picture about 3 weeks ago of their parliament. These guys are having, how would I say, as he's slapping that guy, a lively parliamentary debate? Unfortunately, I could not get a picture of where these guys were throwing shoes at these guys. My point here is that although Abadi is a good guy, and we're trying to help him, his underpinning in Baghdad is very tenuous. In fact, the entire parliament building was occupied by a faction and their young militia thugs just about a month ago. So this is a real problem. Abadi's position is very tenuous, and that's the guy we're depending on. That's the guy we are depending on, and it's very tenuous. Okay, well, that's the Iraq. I just want to leave with one other thought, which is Libya. The Islamic State now has 3 groups that are loyal to it in Libya. They have expanded. They control some of the oil fields now up along the coast here. The good news is, just in the last month, A new government is formed in Tripoli, which is up here, and they're now fighting the guys that are over here. And so we're kind of where we are in Syria and Iraq, hoping that the Libyan army, which is going to get help from the Europeans and the Americans, will be able to defeat the Islamic State, but you still have to wonder about how they're going to pull themselves together. And that's a different issue. Remember the governance issue, how you're going to rebuild, how you're going to create jobs, how you're going to get young men to not join the Islamic State. Let me just sum up then. This is my assessment of how the Obama administration is doing. If I was advising a presidential candidate, this is what I'd say. Yeah, they are doing a good job limiting the Islamic State's fighting and terrorism capability. They're cutting resources, they're taking territory so they can't generate new resources, making it harder for fighters to get in. Fighters to get in. It's different from recruiting locally. They are taking ground back from the Islamic State, absolutely. The Western Front in Syria, are they creating sustainable solutions? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Those Syrian Kurds and those Arabs are going to be fighting. It's already happening. They creating sustainable solutions on the Eastern Front in Iraq? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Already you can see the fighting there. Remember that video I showed you? Are they enhancing American credibility in the region? No. The Saudis are so angry, the Turks are so angry that they're just waiting for the Obama administration to end, frankly. And are they creating sustainable solutions in new Islamic State zones like Libya? Too early to tell, but it's based on what we've seen in Syria and Iraq, I can't be too hopeful. I want to then conclude with this. The Islamic State is a threat, has to be fought. It's not a military problem fundamentally. It's a problem that feeds on sectarian and ethnic differences. You have to treat those. They can be treated, by the way, but you have to deal with those. F-16s and carpet bombing do not fix political problems. So with that, Jack, Karen, thank you very much for inviting me here, and I look forward to a lively question and answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ford. Now, I'm often accused of leaving my students depressed and confused, but I think I've been outdone. I guess there are two key questions that I'd like to start off, and then I will ask the audience to raise their hands and identify themselves, first names only, and stand if you can, and give us your question. But my question to start the thing off would be, I'm often asked, well, why should we even be involved at all in this mess that you have just explained? And why should we take refugees from this very messy situation?
Yeah. So why should we be involved? You have probably heard about the attack in Paris. You've probably heard about the attack in Brussels. Do not for an instant think that it can't happen here. Do not for an instant think. Let me tell you a story. When I was still working at the State Department, we were watching social media, some of the extremist groups, and we found a story that really struck all of us. This was in 2013. A young man who's nom de guerre in Syria. He was fighting not for the Islamic State, he was fighting for the Al-Qaeda groups in Syria. His nom de guerre was Abu Amriki el-Houri, the American freedom fighter. The American freedom fighter was a young Caucasian male, red beard, and he was fighting with Al-Qaeda in Syria. And he came home to Florida in 2013, visited his family. The posting on Facebook included a picture of him holding a little kitty cat. He visited his family, and then he left, went back to Turkey, went back into Syria, and detonated himself in a suicide car bomb. That one, at least, was aimed at the Syrian government, not at Americans. The FBI and the other Homeland Security Agency, they had no idea who that guy was. They had no idea that he was there. Intelligence work, like any human endeavor, is not 100% perfect. Intelligence work can be very good, it can do great things, but it's a human endeavor, and it is always prone to some degree of error. I do not mean to criticize the CIA, I don't mean to criticize the FBI. They're very dedicated, they work very hard, and they do great things, but they are not perfect. And so, if you wish to reduce the threat of terrorism further in the United States, if you're willing to live with a certain degree of problem, that's okay. But if you want to reduce it further, you have to deal with this. You have to. Now, the refugee issue, to me, is a part of it, but not in the way you might think. Donald Trump's statements about banning Muslims and surveying Muslims have actually now showed up in Islamic State recruitment videos. They've also showed up in the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, which is called the Shabab. They're also in their social media and recruitment videos, they're using Donald Trump statements. They're using those statements to help get recruits. We're bombing with F-16s. We have U.S. Special Forces at risk. We've lost several special operators in Iraq already. We lost one just a couple of weeks ago. On this hand, we're fighting them militarily. On this hand, politically, we're helping them recruit. The military hand, F-16 special operations, is not in sync with the political hand. That's what I was talking about here. They need to be in sync. They need to be in sync. Otherwise, we'll have F-16s bombing terrorist targets in Syria and Iraq for the next 20 years. How to get them in sync? The political side has to move in sync. When the United States says, we're not going to take Syrian refugees, that feeds right into the recruitment videos for the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. It undermines the work that the F-16 pilots are doing. It undermines the work that the Special Operations Forces are doing. It helps the recruitment of the very people these people are fighting. So we have a national security interest in allowing some Syrian refugees. Now, I have to tell you, this is not like Europe. Syrian refugees coming to the United States don't walk across borders from Greece to Serbia to Croatia to Austria. They get on airplanes after they've been thoroughly screened, and I happen to know a lot about this process, having seen it in action. They're thoroughly vetted. Each applicant has an entire dossier assembled by the intelligence community. Is it perfect? No. Is it very good? Almost certainly it is. It takes almost 2 years to vet the Syrian refugees. 2 years. And if you're wondering, like, what are they doing? They have an initial interview and they say, okay, where are you from? Oh, you're from this area over here, this district. What's the street? The intelligence people then get that information. They're like, who do we know on that street? Any bad guys? Oh, this bad group is close to that area. This bad group is close to that area. Go back and ask that applicant, what's the relationship between these families that we know were bad guys over here? Ask them to explain that. This is a very laborious process. As I said, it takes, in many cases, it takes 2 years. So I don't think, frankly, the 70% of Syrian refugees that are women and children and the other 30% that are mostly older men, I don't think they present a big security risk. Here's a statistic. I was in a debate in New York in January with David Frum, who used to be George W. Bush's speechwriter, about Syrian refugees, so I did some research on this. We've let in 150,000 Iraqi refugees since 2009. 150,000 refugees. Do you know how many have been involved in terrorism offenses up to May of 2016 out of 150,000? 5. Out of those 5, 3 were arrested for trying to leave the United States to join Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State and fight in Syria. 2 were involved in trying to set up a network here. 2 out of 150,000. It's 1 out of every 75,000. Is there no risk, security risk with Syrian refugees? No, there is a smaller risk. 1 out of 75,000 if the Iraqi experience is to be believed. I would submit to you that that risk is worth taking so that the special operators and the F-16s have a better chance to finish their side of the job in Syria and Iraq. And frankly, I'm not even talking about what's written on the Statue of Liberty, which we should also be thinking about. I'm just addressing the security risk that Mr. Trump is talking about. So, yes, I do have a political viewpoint.
That works.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, over here.
Thank you for your depressing presentation. If you were asked to be the chief advisor to the President of the United States on strategy for how we should deal with this situation, what would be your key points?
On the Syria side, do not rely on that Syrian Kurdish group I was talking about. That is a false flag. That's a terrorist organization. It's going to cause problems for a NATO ally, and it's going to cause problems with the Sunni Arabs in Syria. Work with Sunni Arabs. Is it aggravating? Yes. Are they often contentious? Yes. Are they more concerned about Bashar al-Assad than the Islamic State? Absolutely they are. Look at the pictures coming out of Aleppo. But those are the people, ultimately, who are going to have to undermine the Islamic State, because the Islamic State recruits from them anyway. So bring them on board. That's on the Syrian side. On the Iraqi side, they're going to have to redouble efforts with the Iraqi army, but I think they're going to have to, it's going to have to be a case of tough love. If I'd been in Brett's briefing last week, I would have said, what's the tough love we're pushing on the Iraqis right now? When they M1 tank, who's held accountable? Is some lieutenant, some captain, some major hauled in and said, why did you give the tank? You're now going to spend the next 3 years in military prison? It's got to be, they're going to have to be able to show some discipline in the Iraqi army. And on the political side, we have to help people like Abadi against those Shia militia. We have to. And that could be everything from having John Kerry, who I haven't seen in Iraq lately, go over there and speak with Abadi standing next to him and say to Iraqis, we can't deal with these Shia militia. If you want to have Shia militia fight a sectarian war in Fallujah, go for it. But if you want our help, then get them out of there, and we'll put in the Iraqi army as it gets better. Does it mean we're going to have a slower battle against the Islamic State? Probably, because the Iraqi Shia aren't going to carry on the fight. It's going to be the Iraqi army, which is less sectarian. Might delay things a little bit. Might mean the Obama administration won't have as much progress by the end of its term. But it will be more sustainable progress. And I'm interested in sustainable progress. I'm not interested in what the Obama administration can do between now and the end of the term. Because the Islamic State was under wraps, and it came back out again. When I left Iraq in 2010, it was basically totally under control. It was almost gone. There were no car bombs in Baghdad in 2010. Mosul was under control. Fallujah was under control. Ramadi was under control. They were all under control. And it came back out. It has to be a sustainable solution. So.
Microphone.
Hi, Hal Gurian. About a year ago, the Kurdish parties in Turkey won enough votes to deprive Erdogan of a majority. Wasn't it at that point that he attacked the Kurds in Turkey, and that's one of the reasons for violence there? And also, why hasn't Erdogan, with the largest army in Turkey, helped fight the ISIS instead of the Kurds?
The sequence in Turkey that I understand is that Erdogan was putting a great deal of political pressure on the Turkish Kurdish party to join his coalition because he wants to change the constitution. Turkish Kurds were reluctant to do that. At the same time, while that political argument was going on the ground, PKK operatives ambushed Turkish police in the city of Cizre and also farther west near Urfa. And that triggered a whole cycle of violence. In the end, Erdogan is going to have to deal with the Turkish Kurds. He can't escape it. Turkey, in order to avoid the civil war, Turkey is going to have a serious political process with its Kurdish community, its Kurdish minority. But whether or not American actions make that easier or more difficult is something we have to worry about. Are we facilitating a political process in Turkey, or are we making it more difficult? If we're helping separatists in Turkey, are we making a civil war more likely or less likely? If we're helping separatists in Turkey, are we making it more or less likely that there will be a civil war in Syria? That's a question for the Obama administration, frankly. You asked about the Turkish army. The Turkish army is not going to go into Syria. They've threatened many times, and they won't. Why won't they? For two reasons. Number one, they look at it as a big mess, and they don't really want to get involved in it. They certainly watched what the Americans did in Iraq 10 years ago, and they were like, oh, we don't want that. No, thank you. It'll be especially difficult for them to go in now, in June of 2016, because if they do, the Russian Air Force will bomb them. And because they will be operating outside of Turkish borders, NATO's alliance won't apply. NATO is a defensive alliance to protect Turkish sovereignty, not to protect Turkish incursions into a neighboring country. So the Turks could be bombed by Russian jets, and the Americans could say, hey, that's not a NATO issue. So I'm quite certain the Turks are not going to send their army in. What they have done against the Islamic State, since you mentioned, they have bombarded with artillery shooting across the Turkish border, over the Turkish border, some Islamic State positions, because the Islamic State has shelled the city of Kilis on many occasions. The border town on the Turkish side killed civilians. I think the Turks now have lost a total of about 15 civilians to Islamic State bombardments. By the way, if the Islamic State was bombarding us on our border from, say, Mexico or Canada, do you think the Americans would react? Yeah. So I'm not here to be an apologist for the Turkish government, but I just would remind you that we have a NATO alliance, and it then, if you don't take care of Turkey, Poland is going to wonder what's going on, the Baltic states. So don't think that this is just a Syria issue and it's not connected. Other countries are watching what we do. Can I tell a story? Do I have time? So friends of mine from another think tank in Washington were in Japan a year ago. And they met with an advisor of the Japanese prime minister. And he said, we don't understand why the president of the United States said there would be a red line with chemical weapons and then did nothing. He said, now we're wondering how serious are the red lines with the North Koreans. And then if we're not sure about those American red lines, the advisor said, then Japan has to rethink its own strategies. That should be sending off some signals. When the president said in his Atlantic magazine interview, I don't know if any of you read it, I hope you did, the interview that Obama gave to a journalist at the Atlantic Monthly named Goldberg. If you have not read it, find it on the internet. It is absolutely fascinating. But Obama at one point said, I don't worry about credibility of the United States. I was flabbergasted. As a foreign policy professional, I was flabbergasted. So, and that story about the Japanese prime minister, it immediately occurred to me. So,
I'm going to ask Emmylou to stand up, but just 1 second now. I want to try to tie something together because you also served in Saudi Arabia. If the Saudis, the Sunni Saudis, are seeing the Iranian Shiites making progress in southern Iraq, and doesn't it help explain the financial wherewithal of ISIS? Do the Saudis and ISIS have an alliance?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I have never seen evidence. I want to be very clear about this. I have never seen evidence. I've never even seen an intelligence report that says that the Saudi government is giving money to Al-Qaeda or giving money to the Islamic State. I have seen lots of intelligence reports of different charities in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Europe and the United States that are funneling money that goes into terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and the Islamic State. In some cases, I suspect the people who are giving the money think they're giving it to Syrian refugees or Iraqi refugees, but the people managing the money have an entirely different intent. This has been raised numerous occasions. I've been in some of these conversations with the Saudis, with the Kuwaitis. They are very resistant to getting into the private financial business of their citizens. But the Saudis, under huge pressure, actually passed a law making it a criminal offense to give any money that ends up in terrorist hands. Last week, the Saudi embassy issued a press release. You can look it up. They said that 117 individuals in Saudi Arabia have been arrested for providing financing to terrorist organizations. Now, arrested is one thing, where they actually tried and jailed. I can't answer that question. Saudi justice is not always, yeah, well, you know. So, but is there more to do? Unquestionably. But I wouldn't say there's an alliance between the Saudi government and the Islamic State. That would be a terrible misreading. The Islamic State has undertaken a number of terrorist attacks inside Saudi Arabia. They've killed Saudi security, they've killed Saudi private citizens.
I was going to ask you about, to tell us more about Putin and Russia's involvement in Syria and Islamic State.
Yeah.
And as long as you brought up Saudi Arabia, I'd like to ask a second question, and that is, what about their proliferation of their educational system throughout the Middle East and what they're funding there?
Yeah. I'm going to stay on Saudi Arabia for a minute. So the Saudi assistance to education is a real problem. You know, there's a very catchy expression in foreign policy circles in Washington. The Americans need to use more soft power. Things like education and opening up our universities and getting people, dealing with the job problem through education and skills, using American soft power. Well, the Saudis have soft power too, but it's pernicious, frankly. How you fix that? They will have to cut funding. And Allison and I served in Cameroon in Central Africa, and there was a great big mosque in the capital city, Yaoundé, and the Saudis had funded it, and the preachers had studied in Saudi Arabia. I didn't go to the mosque. I don't know what kind of things they were saying in their sermons, but you have to be suspicious, frankly. And so that's a problem. And I would assume that whoever is the next president will have to deal with that firmly. You will not change the Saudis overnight. I think the royal family, especially some of these younger people that are coming up, like Mohammed bin Salman, the deputy crown prince who's visiting Washington right now, I think they'd like to get rid of the clerical establishment. They understand it's a risk. But the clerical establishment is firmly entrenched, and it's not going to be easy to move it. With respect to Putin and the Russians, let's see, what can I say? I don't think the Russians in Syria like Bashar al-Assad one little bit. And I've had a lot of private meetings with Russian officials, including I've been in meetings with John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov. Sergei Lavrov is not a very nice man, but he's a very smart guy. And it's clear to me the Russians think that Bashar al-Assad is a fool. He should never have gotten himself into this mess. Not bad analysis, actually. How they fix the Syria problem is less evident to me. I think here I disagree with John Kerry's analysis. You know the expression, if the bank lends you $1,000 and you can't pay the bank, then you have a problem. But if the bank lends you $1 million and you can't pay them back, then the bank has a problem. Well, Bashar al-Assad has borrowed millions and millions from the Russians. And if the Russians were to just say, to heck with it, and Bashar al-Assad fell, which he would, then the Russians lose credibility. And right now, Putin is trying to build Russian credibility. He's trying to make Russia more of a player, return Russia to its historic role, including in the Middle East, which is very close to Russia. It's a lot closer to Russia than it is to the United States, geographically. So they're sort of stuck. They can't just march. Literally, I've heard a very senior Russian official say to me in a one-on-one meeting, he said, what do you think, we're just going to march into his office and say, Bashar al-Assad, you have to pack up and go? And he's going to say, oh, I didn't realize. He puts his stuff in his briefcase and walks out of his office. He said, it doesn't work like that. He said, we can't. He said, we don't have the ability to enforce that. And do I have time for a story? So
Always.
in 2000, and I got to get my dates right, 2006, in June of 2006, I was in Iraq I was the senior political advisor to our ambassador, Zalmay Khalilzad. And at that point, George W. Bush had said, we cannot deal with the then Iraqi Prime Minister, Ibrahim Jaafari. Ibrahim Jaafari was a disaster in the war. He was very sectarian. The Iraqi civil war in 2006 was spiraling up. We were taking more and more casualties, being in the middle of the fighting. And the Iraqi Prime Minister at that time, Jaafari, was a disaster. And so we got instructions from the White House, you go in and tell him he's got to go. He's got to quit. And so Zal and I, get in the car and we go to the Prime Minister's office. And Zal Khalilzad, for 2 hours, went back and forth with Jaafari. We can't work with you anymore. You've done great work, but you got to go. He started off nice. You've done great work, but you got to go. By the end of the 2 hours, he's like, we can't work with you. You can't get to where we need to go. You have to leave. And Jaafari kept saying, I have the votes in the parliament. I have the votes in the parliament. I have the votes in the parliament. I'm not going anywhere. We left at like midnight, and Zal and I went back to his office, and Zal was like totally pumped up because he was going to have to tell the president of the United States. Just failed. He slammed his fist as hard as he could on his desk, and he said, I have 170,000 troops in this country. How can Ibrahim Jaafari say no to me? And I was so tired, I just wanted to go to bed. I said to him, because he knows we won't leave. That's where the Russians are, I think, with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And Bashar al-Assad is plenty smart to understand that. Plus, he's got the little Iranian thing in his pocket, too. So I'm afraid Mr. Putin, everybody thinks he's so smart. Not so clear to me.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate the insights that you offer to us. Getting back to the Sunni, Shia, Kurd, Iraq, Iran, and so forth.
Theater.
Yeah. The story you just told, you've got troops, but he's the guy there.
Right.
He's one of them.
Yeah.
So when we look at our larger foreign policy and how to move forward with troops, without troops, and the questions of governance that you mentioned, young, unemployed, males, brimming with testosterone, why?
And resentment.
Yes. Why, and someone else asked, why should we be there? I don't mean that we shouldn't be involved in some way, but with the huge cost of arming and having our arms go, having our own people die, and so forth, with this split between Sunnis and Shias and Kurds, and the fact that there is no governance and our version doesn't translate over there.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. It's absolutely true.
Would you run that through one more time?
Yeah,
Why we should be involved?
Because it's like this. If you don't deal with the Middle East will deal with you. I hate to say it, but it's that simple. And it may be that they're not going to deal by, bombing Traverse City, but I have to tell you, they will come. And if they don't come to Detroit or to Michigan or to New York or Washington, they'll bring down American airliners somewhere in the world. And by the way, they're actually breaking the European Union apart. And it's been a historic policy of the United States dating back to the end of the Second World War in 1945 that Europe needs to unify so that we don't have another world war in Europe. So the Middle East is sort of inescapable. Now, does that mean we have to send F-16s all the time? No. As I said, a lot of the problems are political. We can't fix their political problems, but there are times when we can play a helpful role. I go back to what I said before. In 2009 and 2010, Al-Qaeda, the mother of the Islamic State, if you will, was basically under wraps in Iraq, and it didn't even exist in Syria at the time. The Iraqis and the Kurds, Sunnis, Shia, had all kind of finally come to an agreement. And it wasn't a perfect agreement, but it wasn't bad. It worked. They muddled through. That's the key word. Muddled through. How did they get there? I have to tell you, the Americans played a huge role in that, because although Hyder al-Abadi could go from clump to clump, there weren't a lot of others like him. Who went from clump to clump? We did. I did. My colleagues did. That's how we got to a government in 2006 and again in 2010. The problem with it is that once the troops pulled out, I'm going to be very blunt with you, once the troops pulled out, the Obama administration focused elsewhere, and the Iraqi government reverted to its old sectarian habits. I wish that the Obama administration had sent Hillary, had sent Kerry, had sent Joe Biden to Iraq in 2011 to say, oh, you want our military aid? Stop jailing Sunnis, stop torturing Sunnis, fix the problem with the Kurds, hold people accountable. But the Obama administration looked the other way. So you have a choice. You can either deal with the Middle East with special ops and F-16s, which has its limits, as I've just explained, or you can roll up sleeves. You will not fix all of their problems, but you can help them set up processes to fix their problems. Absolutely not American democracy. No way. I won't even tell you some of the conversations we had with George W. Bush. So, but can you get them to talk to each other? Which would be a start. You know, Saddam Hussein didn't talk to his enemies. He killed them. So for the Iraqis to learn to talk to their adversaries, that's actually an achievement. No, I'm not kidding. And it's the same in Syria, by the way. Assad doesn't talk to his enemies, he bombs them. They're going to have to learn to talk to each other. So can we help them talk to each other? Probably. Can we fix the problems? No, they have to fix the problems. So.
We have a lot of questions still. Do we have time for more questions?
I'm at your disposal, Jack.
All right, let's take one here. We have one over there, and that'll be the two. So we have one more. Joe.
You haven't painted a very pretty picture.
Sorry, I can't see you. Ah, there, thanks.
But clearly the goal is a sustainable solution. And it seems to me that back after World War I, somebody took 4 jigsaw puzzles and put them in a box and shook them up. And, you know, what we're trying to do is put whole cloth, completed jigsaw puzzles out of an impossible jumble of mixed pieces.
Yeah.
Is there any way, really, to get a sustainable solution without going back to the whole World War I border resolutions?
Yeah, I go back, you're absolutely right. I mean, is the Sykes-Picot and subsequent treaty arrangements, are those sustainable borders? I don't know if they're sustainable borders. I can't say. I do think a new Kurdish state is coming. And I think the real question is, How do you do that in a way that doesn't make the fighting even worse? I don't know if any of you are following the news today, but today there was fighting between Iranian Revolutionary Guards in northwestern Iran and Kurdish guerrillas in Iran. So a new Kurdish state, you can sort of see that it's coming. So I go back to what I said to the young lady over here. It's a question of process. I have always said to the Kurds, you want an independent state? Perfectly reasonable demand. But declare it unilaterally? Oh, then you're going to cause a lot of fighting. It has to be negotiated. Negotiated with the neighbors, with the Turks, with the Iranians, with the Arabs. So, can we help facilitate a negotiation? Almost certainly. But we can't if we just ignore it. So, can you get the right people at the table to begin talking? Probably. To be honest, I'm going to meet a Russian delegation in Berlin in a couple of weeks to talk about this. So it's not ignoring the Middle East, but this isn't a case of F-16s either. This is diplomacy.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank Ambassador Robert Ford and Allison Barkley for being here.
Yes! Thank you. Thanks, Jeff.